All right, so welcome back to the last 3 sessions of Hybrid Music Lab this year. So the last 3 sessions will be a brainwave composition or performance. So the next talk on this stage is called Concentric, Enter Altered States Through Sound. And this is a neurofeedback-based sound performance exploring altered consciousness through rhythm and resonance. And the performer is Jason J. Snell. Do I pronounce this right? Yeah. He's an artist and founder of Primary Assembly, blending sound design, neuroscience, and sensory feedback. His performances and installations explore entrainment and the boundaries of human perception. Please give it up for Jason.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthias. And thank you for having me at the conference. Everything I've seen today has been fantastic, so really great work. What I'll be doing is I'll be describing some concepts that I researched this year about how sound forms, and then be showing elements piece by piece. I'll be playing different audio elements, and then that will slowly build into a short, I call them biofeedback soundbaths. And this presentation is a way to educate and break down it piece by piece. I'll be reading a bit, but each slide is quite simple. This is a study of how various cultures use sound to induce meditative and transcendent states, particularly with repeating rhythms with different oscillating intensity. Although there's some focus on specific musical forms, so there were specific cultures that I studied this year, and then my own experience in the rave and techno scene since the 90s. There's a greater focus on the process of formation and how these sounds come into existence and how they're formed. So it's not so much specific like me trying to recreate an ancestral culture or ritual, but looking at the fundamentals of creation. No small task. So every sound starts with silence. And that's the foundation I wanted to look at first. It has to arise from something. And so I spent some of the time in the research looking at what is silence and how do you sonify silence. Silence is similar to, if you were painting, it'd be like a blank canvas. So you start, there's no form yet. So silence is sound without form. But silence itself isn't absolute. Even with quantum physics, it shows that there's always activity occurring on the subatomic level. And silence is similar. So when we think about what does silence sound like, particularly like in this room right now, so I'll be quiet for a few seconds, like what do you hear? And if no one's talking, supposedly it's silent, but let's see what we hear. What do you all hear? Like, can you name any of the things that we're hearing? You hear what?
The refrigerator.
The refrigerator, yep. A fan, yeah. I hear an HVAC system. It's kind of rattling. Silence is quite relative. So this room is a bit noisy because of the HVAC system, but there's always some sort of sound. So for example, I've lived in New York and my home state is Iowa. So what I consider as silent in New York is much noisier than if I'm out in the prairie in Iowa. It's, there's still sound, but it's much quieter. So even the idea of what is silent is quite relative. And silence plays a crucial role in sound composition. So even something like techno, there's a beat and then there's a space, and then there's a beat and then there's a space. If you didn't have silence, it would just be a constant beat. There would be no space for it to breathe and create this oscillating rhythm. And so I looked at how do I sonify silence. And yesterday when I was doing sound check, I have a recorder here. So I recorded several seconds of silence in this room. And then what I'm doing is I amplified the very low end and So that's this room with the low end boosted. So I trimmed out all the other mid and highs out and just have that low end. And then I sonified the very, very high end. So this one is a bit painful to hear. I won't keep it on long or turn it on loud. It's just that scratchy, really high. And both of those, both that high and the low, a high sound, so I won't give that. What I'm doing is I'm sonifying the silence at the ends of the spectrum to show that there's all this activity that's beyond the range that we can hear. So there's sounds that are lower than we can hear. Often we can feel it, but they even get lower than that. It doesn't mean they're not there. It just means that we're not perceiving it with our human bodies and our human ears. And then same with the high end, so certain animals can hear higher than us. Those sounds are there, we just don't hear them because we're built in a way that our range is based on our survival. And so this plays into the idea of what's on the edges of our perception. The next step is looking at a field of consciousness. All forms are temporary, and all temporary forms manifest from this field of consciousness. So think of it as this energy field that's constant, and it has no form. It's not a beat, it's not a string sound, but it's just this field of creation. And whether it's a sound or an image or a life form, the idea is that we all come from this eternal source. In the Vedic tradition, this is described as a unified field of energy or ocean of consciousness. And so the waves start to come up from it, but the actual consciousness is this formless field. This could also be called like the Tao or Chi or Prana, the universe. So different cultures have different ideas of what this eternal place is in which we and all other forms are birthed from. It's interesting, how do you sonify something internal? Because we can't actually perceive it, it can only be experienced through transcendence. So when we bypass our senses, we then can experience that eternal, that spiritual experience or a God experience. And even though we can't perceive it, that's where all forms come from. They emerge from that. So we're all born of this field of consciousness. What I use is just a solid drone sound. So it's not a beat. And it's just this presence. And so that was the best way that I could sonify that field of consciousness. And then I added some bass to create some presence too. So we're starting to see the different elements that I use in the sound bath step by step. So that field of consciousness, as it's moving into form, what it starts to do is and this is from the Vedic tradition, it starts to reverberate off of itself. So it starts to have this slow movement going back and forth. And those reverberations are the precursor to form. And what it is it's when consciousness is interacting with itself, creates a reverberation. So every time I interact with another being or really anything in consciousness, there's a reverb between myself and them, and that starts to create movement. A way to think of it would be like ripples in water. So it's just a little bit of movement, and then those ripples are the reverberations, and that's the beginning of form, the beginning of sound. And so I'll bring back that drone sound, and I'll start to add some reverberations. Got the drone and you start And so that starts to become the bridge between that eternal source and then the beginning of form. So as those reverberations start to swell, they start to have more form. So we start to hear those ebbs and flows. And they're very temporary and unstable. So that just like in an ocean, it's an ocean wave comes up and then it collapses right back into that field of existence. So it's not a form that persists for long. It's just and then falls back in. Hinduism describes a cosmic cycle of creation, preservation, and destruction. And in music, it's the same as an envelope on a synthesizer, which is attack, sustain, and then release. And so it could be a synthesizer note, or it could be an entire civilization. It has a creation, it sustains for a while, and then it decays back into nothing. And so that is mirrored in something as simple as me hitting the table, that there was a creation of that sound, it sustained briefly, and then it released back into the silence. And these emerging forms, those reverbs, go through that cycle quite quickly. We have this swell and then it dips back in. And then we start to have form. And these forms start to last longer. And the way that I'm doing this acoustically is I start taking elements of that drone cycle, adding the reverb, and starting to create these almost sounds like ocean waves. So you start to have these temporary forms. Let's listen to that. Starting to layer them. So we've got the field of existence, and then we've got the reverberations, and then we've got these waves that are being picked out of that source, that field of creation, and they have these temporary existence, and then it melts back in. Bring this back down a little bit. And as the emergent energy begins to take hold, it starts to sustain form longer and longer. And it's long enough for it to coalesce, become something, and be perceived by us. So there's a form, lots of forms pop in and out of existence quite quickly, like quantum behavior is just, and there's very hard to perceive it with instruments. But each form has its own timing. It comes into existence, has a sustain, and that releases back into that drum. And then the form that I use, and this is common in ancestral cultures as well as in techno, is the form of a kick drum or a heartbeat. And so that becomes an anchor of the journey. So having that beat over and over is the anchor that allows people to dance for hours on end, or people to move into like a trance state or a meditative state, like in a drumming circle. So it's both in ancestral and rave culture, sounds are used to recreate the resonance of the womb. So in terms of having a universal music, there's all these different cultures, but the one thing that is universal is all of us spent several months in our mother's womb. And so the fundamentals that we experience there are, we hear the heartbeat, we hear the blood flow, and we most likely hear voices, either her voice or the voice of others. And those are the elements that exist both in ancestral cultures and in techno music. When what I've discovered in doing these types of biofeedback sound baths is that using a beat and using white noise starts to induce a trance state. And started moving to a trance state. What it does is it induces a trance state. And when you move into a trance state, You can lose sense of time, space, and self. At louder volumes and intense vibrations, these soundscapes can overwhelm the sense of self and lead to like an ego death or transcendence. So particularly at louder volumes, perhaps people have experienced this in front of a bass band at a techno party, where the vibrations are so intense and it's the right time of night and everything is kind of clicking, you lose sense of self and you become the sound, because the sound is more of an impression than your sense of yourself. Also, prolonged silence and deprivation can also lead to an ego death. So you can go to either extremes. It can be intense sound, like a noisescape, or people do deprivation tanks or silent retreats for many days on. And that's a sense of deprivation. I'm going to move right into the sound bath so we can experience it for a few minutes. And I'll be using my live heartbeat. So the beat that we'll hear will be coming from me. And those ocean wave sounds will be coming from the stress level in my brain. So I'm using this biosensor headset. Feel free to just let the music guide where your brain goes. You can eyes closed, eyes open, whatever you prefer. So just to wrap up, that's a very short version of the sound bath. Essentially, I constructed a form, and then that form takes people on a journey. And then when that journey is complete, that form dissolves because its purpose is over. And then that becomes a metaphor for our own existence. We have this vehicle on Earth for ideally several decades. We have a form, we have a certain purpose to fulfill, and then when that purpose is over, we die and then absorb back into creation. Here's my info. If you're interested in more information about this, I'm also beginning to do these long form, like 45-minute sound baths online. I tried it for the first time last week. As long as someone has good headphones and they're cozy at home, they have just an intense, deep experience as if they're at an in-person sound bath that's like a 45-minute or hour long. If you have any questions, I'll be around. Thank you again, Matthias, for having me here.